Hello everyone and welcome back. It feels like it's been a while since I did a long video. I put up a poll on my community tab and you guys voted overwhelmingly in favor of a video about my favorite albums of the last decade. We're not quite halfway through 2023, but we are about 3.5 years into this decade, so what better time than now to go over the previous? I realized recently that I hadn't shared this list at all. I threw it up on my Twitter not too long ago with this picture, and I realized in that moment that I hadn't shared this stuff with the channel yet, and I figured this would be a fun topic to go over because I think people like lists like these. I think I'm gonna have to break this up into a few videos, so I'm gonna start probably from the bottom of my list and make my way up to my favorites. But I'm gonna have fun with this because given that I'm used to just 10 seconds per album, I'm gonna talk a little bit more because these albums mean something to me. Before I jump into it, I just want to talk parameters a little bit. Like I said, this is the graphic that I shared on Twitter, and I made this right around the year 2020. I chose to go with the top 30 albums, and the choice to go with 30 was purely aesthetic. I wanted to make this image. I could do 4 different square graphics, 1x1, 2x2, 3x3, 4x4. So 30 was the first parameter that I forced on myself. The other one that I like to do was to limit myself to no more than 2 albums per artist. And along with limiting the number per artist, I also wanted to limit the number per year. I didn't have a rough limit in mind, but I wanted to kind of represent each year to the best of my ability. If I didn't put a limitation on like that, I would have clogged this up with too many albums from 2016. You can go ahead and ask Alpha Media about that, he understands. And finally, a parameter specific to this video I'm making now. Like I said, I made this list right about in 2020, actually before I started this channel. And truthfully, when I look at it now, there's things that I might move around and there's albums that I might want to swap in. But I wanted to stay true to myself, at least the version of myself that made this list. And you know what? If I make all these videos and you guys really enjoy them, maybe I'll do an honorable mentions too and kind of talk about the things I would include if I were to update the list, because I can think of a few already. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. I'm going to start at 30, and I'll probably do 10 in this video, so we're going to wind up at 21. So number 30 for the last decade, or the 2010s to be more specific, is going to be Lana Del Rey's Born to Die. More specifically, though, the Paradise Edition, which is Born to Die plus the EP Paradise. And you guys did express some interest in potentially doing a vinyl video down the road, so I might show these off just a little bit. Not to flex, I just thought it would be more entertaining than just seeing me talking. Lana Del Rey has really come into her own in the last few years. I mean, we've all seen it. This year especially, I'm still kind of obsessed with her most recent album. But, a few years ago when she released NFR, or, if your kids aren't watching, it's called Norman fucking Rockwell. With that album, Lana kind of turned the tide in her favor. For years and years, the critics were not really on board with what she was doing. I obviously don't feel the same way because this was, her big debut was Born to Die, and I loved it immediately. I think people didn't really know if she was genuine in the character that she was inhabiting with her music. She's always kind of presented herself as this Lolita kind of figure, as sort of a foil to traditional American values and Americana iconography. You pair that kind of mystique with the voice that she has and the quality and texture to her voice. I was a fan just right out the gate. There's so many bangers on Born to Die, and I have to include the Paradise Edition because the EP Paradise that followed pretty much immediately after Born to Die has some amazing songs too. Arguably one of my favorites on both projects is Ride, and that's on Paradise. And of course there's some amazing music videos to check out with this album, specifically National Anthem. Ride is a great one too, but National Anthem is another favorite for me. I don't know what more I can say about this album. I think most people are familiar with it, and I'm not really upset that she didn't get the praise that I thought she deserved at the time, because she came into her own now. And honestly, her newest album might be better than this. It's going to take some time for me to clarify that. But man, that new one is really up there. If you haven't heard Born to Die or the Paradise Edition, the 2 tracks I just named are great, either Ride or National Anthem. I'd honestly be shocked if you haven't heard this album yet, but if you haven't, go ahead and start there. So number 29 for me is going to be White Men or Black Men 2 from Young Fathers. I think this album is a little lesser known. If I had to pick one on the list that maybe the fewest people are aware of, this might be it. But man, this is a really special album to me. Obviously, I think the reason I listened to it at first is because the title was so intriguing, and I like the bright colors on the album cover. Young Fathers, if you're not familiar, is a band, I believe, from Scotland. It's hard to really put a pin in what genre of music they make. I don't even know what label I would attach it to. I've watched a video, I think, where they describe themselves as making pop music, or maybe that was this album specifically. If I call it pop music and you listen to it, you're not going to agree. But man, they really do nail some great pop melodies, and a lot of these tracks are bangers, which is cool. As far as I know, I think it's a group of just 3 guys. Very loud, abrasive vocals, and a lot of non-traditional instrumentation that they're doing. Really interesting percussive stuff going on. There's so much distinct flavor to this album, a lot of sounds that honestly I had never heard before hearing this. In the time since I became a fan with this one, they've made a couple other albums like Cocoa Sugar, and this year even with Heavy Heavy. And those are great, but this one is something special to me. It's not a very long project, coming in just under 40 minutes, but if you want a place to start, if you want one track to take away from this, I would suggest Nest. Nest is one of the ones on here that I think, if we're gonna call this pop, I think that has the best pop potential. But yeah, listen to Nest. You could try Shame or 27. There's a lot of cool stuff on here, and I promise you the album is worth listening to. Number 28 for me is going to be JPEG Mafia's All My Heroes Are Cornballs. This, I think, is probably the most recent album on the list. Pray you get comfy. A few years before this album came out, I became aware of JPEG Mafia thanks to his mixtape that was hilariously titled Black Ben Carson. And immediately I was hooked, because this was a guy that I could tell was just exploring textures in hip-hop that I had not heard many people doing. A lot of people compared him to Death Grips. I feel like he does not take that kindly, and I don't think the comparison is very strong because he does a lot of different things. And if you haven't heard it, this album is the perfect example of that. With Black Ben Carson and Veteran, it was very abrasive, and then this album came along and it was a lot more atmospheric, a lot more melodic music that he was making, but it still had that experimental edge, and I think that's why I fell in love with this one so much. It's kind of crazy. I went back and listened to it recently, and it seems tame compared to the few albums that he's released since, both with LP and, of course, most recently Scaring the Hose with Danny Brown. 2 albums that I really, really love, and I might honestly put ahead of this one. It's crazy to me because I think the reason this album ranks so highly is because when I heard it, it was unlike anything I had heard before, and I was so impressed with it. And it just seems funny to me that having heard more JPEG Mafia for a few years, going back to this, it doesn't seem as revolutionary now. But again, that's why I'm choosing to honor the version of myself that made this list in 2020. Because yeah, even if I've become familiar with this album and with JPEG Mafia's style, going back and listening to it is still an amazing experience. Even now, as a fan, when I listen to JPEG Mafia albums, I have no idea what's going to happen on any given track. He absolutely deserves all the recognition that he's gotten over the last few years, and I'm just happy to be along for the ride. If you haven't heard this album, I think the best place to start would be the opening track, which was also the lead single. It's called Jesus Forgive Me, I Am a Thought. That gives you a sense of this guy's humor, but the song is amazing. Another great one would be BBW, which stands for not what you're thinking, but Black Brian Wilson. Fantastic album. Coming in at number 27, this one might be kind of controversial in the sense that a lot of people are going to want it higher, but Kendrick Lamar's Good Kid, Mad City. Me and my niggas trying to get it, you bitch. I became a fan of TDE right around when I started becoming a fan of hip-hop in general, and that was about 2013 or so. So I had some catching up to do with albums like this, and at least one other that's going to appear on the list. This is one of those albums that I don't think I have to say very much, because we all kind of recognize that it is a monumental piece of work. So monumental that it lost the Best Rap Album Grammy to Macklemore. I'm sorry, I just can't resist bringing that up. It's a fantastic concept album. And at the time I heard this, I don't think I had heard a concept album in hip-hop like that. And there's so much good to this. There's a lot of old school West Coast hip-hop stuff being explored. You've got shout-outs to guys like E40 and contributions from MC8. Kendrick was absolutely paying homage to the West Coast and to Compton. It's a very rich, descriptive album that kind of walks us through Kendrick's life experience growing up in Compton. It's no surprise that the guy who made this album went on to be the guy that he is now, because you could tell listening to this that this guy was just something else. I could tell that, and I was just getting into hip-hop, I think one of the reasons this album comes in kind of low on my list is because of the song Real. I do not like that song at all. I don't think I've ever listened to it all the way through. I have to skip inevitably because it just drags on and it is too basic for my liking. You guys have probably seen my review of Damn, and a big reason why I don't love that album is because the hooks are very basic. And given what Kendrick is capable of, and we see it on every album, it just shocks me sometimes to hear from Kendrick Lamar one of the most basic hooks I've ever heard. The song Real is, I'm real, I'm real, I'm really, really real. It's just not for me. That song aside, basically everything else on here is close to, if not a masterpiece. If you've never heard this album before, that's kind of unbelievable. But go ahead and listen to something like Money Trees. Money Trees has been a go-to song for me for years and years, just to get hyped for anything. It's just such a great song. Roll the windows down, blast that all summer. Amazing. If you're looking for more of a taste of his artistic abilities, then you can go for Sing About Me, I'm Dying of Thirst, or you could go for Mad City or Good Kid. I really, really love this album, and it's going to hold a place in my heart for the rest of my life, for sure. Given that I was exposed to this as early as I was in my journey into hip-hop, this one's going to be with me forever. And yeah, if you haven't heard this yet, please go check it out.
This is your station, baby. Look inside these walls and you see them.
Coming in at number 26, this album's probably tied with Young Fathers for one of the ones that you're less likely to be aware of, but this is Go Farther in Lightness from Gang of Youths. And since this is a special vinyl, I'll show you this one. It's kind of a black and white splash or swirl, whatever you'd call that. Gang of Youths is an Australian band that I had never heard of before listening to this album. And I'd never heard of when I listened to this album. This is one where I pulled up Apple Music on a Friday, looked at the new releases, saw this, and the cover intrigued me, and I said, you know what, let me just listen to this. So I threw it in a playlist, and I think I was going on a trip somewhere. I was listening to this on a plane, and man, I was absolutely blown away. Gobsmacked, if you will. I would describe this as like indie stadium rock. Comparisons to be drawn to maybe The National or another band that you're going to see on this list, Japandroids. But they make a lot of big rock anthems, and there's a lot of emotion to their music. This is a big, dense album. It's pretty long, but there are so many tracks on here that really struck a chord with me. So much so that, yeah, this band I never heard of gained a lifelong fan off of this one project. It's pretty interesting. I don't know what the general reception is to their music. You know, I was looking for reviews of this album back when I first heard it, and it was hard to find any. I mean, to shout out the busiest music nerd himself, Anthony Fantano, I think I could only find this in a Why You Know review video. So I don't know what the reception was at the time. I just see a lot of people like me who are like, hey, this album's really good. Why didn't people talk about it more? But that's what I'm here for. I would highly recommend listening to this in full if you've got the time. It's a very triumphant listen. There's a great emotional path that you'll take with this album, and by the end of it, it's very uplifting. If you don't want to start with the whole album, you just want to sample, I would recommend starting with The Deepest Sighs, The Frankest Shadows. Or oddly enough, since one of my favorites on here is sort of a darker track, and if you want to listen to something that might tug at the heartstrings a bit more, go with Persevere. It's an incredible song. Beautiful, heartbreaking stuff. I would love to see these guys continue to get the profile that I think they deserve. They did put out another album recently, but it's got nothing on Go Farther in Lightness. If you need a place to start with this band, you got to start here.
There's nothing too near to absurdity.
So next at 25, we've got Katy Perry with Teenage Dream. This is another unique one. It's pressed on white wax, and I thought I saw something about this being scratch and sniff, but mine does not smell like anything. So this, I think, is an oddball pick for sure. Obviously, it's pop music. There's not a whole lot to it, right? Well, maybe there is. See, with this album, Katy Perry tied Michael Jackson's record for the most #1 singles from one album. Only the second person to ever do that. And yet, it didn't win any Grammys, which I think is odd. Obviously, with Katy Perry, this isn't an issue of the Grammys being racist, but it's just an extension of the fact that they tend to get it wrong. Pop music might not be your thing, and that's okay if it's not. Look, I'm not somebody that listens to a whole lot of pop music either, but damn, this album really hits. The title track, Teenage Dream, is amazing. I could just read off the track list because they're all hits, but this one came out, this was in 2010, so this was the beginning of the decade, and I was in high school at the time, and, you know, she owned the charts, obviously. Like I just said, 5 #1 singles from one album is pretty insane, but the songs hold up. Katy Perry's put out a number of albums since this one, and this is, I would say, undeniably her pinnacle. Maybe not in terms of artistic originality, but this is pop music, so I'm not really looking for that. I'm looking for bangers. And by my count, no pop album from the last decade has as many bangers as this one. If somehow you evaded Katy Perry's music in 2010, I don't know how that would be possible, but definitely start with Teenage Dream. So at 24 is a band I hope everybody's familiar with by now. It's Always with Antisocialites. This one's cool. The inner sleeve has a lot of illustrations. You know, I think one for each song on the album. And I believe, yeah, this is a yellow wax. Very cool one. So I became a fan of Always at a time when I think a lot of people did. And that was with their song Archie Marry Me. And that's not on this album, but that was sort of their big break. This album, however, is the one that has stuck with me the longest. And honestly, I'm going to be listening to this forever. I think the best genre description for these guys is dream pop. All the instrumentals are washed out like they're coming from some old radio. It's odd that I say that because there's a lyric on this album about the night is like a fading radio. Yeah, Molly Rankin and the Gang. This is a Canadian band. They're making these amazing, amazing songs. These are all, I think, capable of being pop bangers, but the sort of retro indie aesthetic that they go for, it gives it a unique texture that I just can't get enough of. Their more recent album, Blue Rev, was a big critical success. I think a lot of people love that one. But I think I'm always going to prefer Antisocialites. If you're wondering why and you want to find out why I prefer this album, go listen to some tracks like In Undertow or Not My Baby. I'd be surprised if you haven't heard anything from this album because a lot of these tracks have legs. I had the pleasure of seeing them in concert last year, and man, that was a great show. This is the perfect kind of music to see live because it just washes over you. Maybe that's why they called that one song In Undertow. I gotta stop doing this. This is another short one though, so I recommend the whole album if you have the time. But yeah, man, always. I will always be listening to this. Well, I couldn't resist that either. Coming in at number 23, it's the favorite band of the worst person you know, Death Grips, ExMilitary. I had to do it. This is most definitely a bootleg. I don't know if there's an official pressing. To the extent I'm going to show it off, it is on a kind of a putrid marble gray. So I remember finding out about Death Grips from a friend who was posting about Government Plates on his Facebook. I really like Government Plates. That's a great album too, but man, ExMilitary, this is the big one. I know what people are thinking. Everybody's like, oh, Money Store, or No Love Deep Web. I don't care. ExMilitary is the album. Pound for pound, I think this is their strongest work. You know, when I talked about JPEG Mafia and the fact that he is certainly more melodic than Death Grips, I find that some of their best stuff, at least to my taste, is when they do have some semblance of melody. Sometimes their music veers a little too far into just noise, and it's a little too unhinged for my liking. Not that it's bad, but I just need something to latch onto. And this album is cool because it has some of their most aggressive, abrasive songs, I think, ever. But at the same time, there's some that have, by my count, the most engaging melodies and the most memorable riffs. If you haven't listened to this album at all, or if you're one of those people who knows about Death Grips and is just refusing to listen to them out of principle, which I get, obviously I have to suggest starting with Guillotine. One of their craziest tracks ever, one of the great music videos that they've ever made. How could you not pick the album that contains Guillotine as the best Death Grips album? Again, that's my take, but it extends beyond Guillotine. Spread Eagle Across the Block is crazy. Tachyon, I Want It, I Need It. This album is also a great demonstration of their sampling, whether it's a clip of dialogue from Charles Manson or a Pet Shop Boys song. I feel like these guys have kind of been outsized by their own legacy, right? They've made their own shoes too big to fill, just with the way music nerds talk about Death Grips. But leaving all that aside, ExMilitary is just fantastic. It is great, angry, loud music that I love. And yeah, when I first heard this, or when I first heard Government Plates, it's nothing like anything else. As many Death Grips albums as I've heard by now, ExMilitary is still the pinnacle for me. Hit! Wanna be, have no fear. Number 22 is an album I hope everybody's heard by now, but it's SZA's Control. And if you can see, this is a signed copy.
Need you for the old me. Need you for myself.
And this is a sort of translucent green. So SZA would be the second TDE artist that has come up on this list, and she won't be the last. I still remember those early days when she first got on the label, right? She had that appearance in their Cypher video, and then I found myself listening to Z, which was this project she put out right around the time that she signed with them. And Z is a really great album too, but I feel like her vocals were kind of timid there. And if you listen to any of her stuff in like 2014, 2015, she's not quite pushing her range the way she does now. Control was, I think, the album where she first really started doing that. I'm not somebody who listens to a ton of R&B. Well, I try to listen to a lot of it, but there's not a ton of it that speaks to me. Control is not just one of my favorite R&B albums ever, but one of my favorite albums, period. I mean, look at where we are on this list. This is ahead of Good Kid, Mad City. I stand by that. This album is incredibly personal. She does a great job displaying vulnerability. And man, that voice is just, it's ridiculous, right? I mean, we can all agree, right, that SZA's voice is insane. I'm not interested in fighting stands on who's got the best range or something, but the texture of her voice, the quality of her voice is just, I don't even care what she's singing half the time. But when I do listen to what she's singing, especially on this album, man, it's a lot of soul searching. It's a lot of finding herself and coming to terms with who she is and loving who she is. Traditional R&B albums don't seem to do a whole lot of that. At least a lot of the traditional ones that I've heard. So yeah, I love the vulnerability on here. I love how personal this one was. And, you know, she made SOS recently, which is also fantastic. And I don't know if it quite hits the high water mark that this one set, but SZA is a generational talent. And I think she was nominated for Grammys on this one, did not win though. Are we surprised? In the off chance that you haven't listened to this album before, I'd be shocked if you haven't at least heard Love Galore, but I would recommend a track like Garden or really one of my favorites on this, probably the highlight for me, is 20 Something. Like, that one's just her singing over acoustic guitar, and you get a real sense of how powerful her voice can be. And it's a song about growing up and losing touch with friends and just navigating your 20-somethings. I'm getting goosebumps just talking about it. So yeah, if you haven't listened to this, same as all the others, you need to.
How could it be 20 something all alone?
So the last one I'm going to talk about in this first part of the video, number 21, is going to be Vampire Weekend's Contra. Do we know who this woman was? I can't remember. Vampire Weekend is an interesting band for me. I think when I was first getting into music or critically acclaimed music, I was looking at sites like Pitchfork for some guidance, which I think is helpful still if you're really trying to get into music. But around that time, 2013, this is when they put out Modern Vampires of the City. I like that album. I don't love it. It just never really clicked for me that way. When I went and listened to Contra, man, everything on this album clicks. It kind of seems like an oddball in their catalog because they're kind of indie rock or art pop, but this one feels really tropical and very summery to me. You're going to get that right away when you open the album with Horchata. Another great example would be Diplomat's Son. That's a crazy song. Like, who comes up with this stuff? I don't know. It's a really cool album. It kind of mixes those tropical world type of sounds with indie rock and a little bit of punk flavor too. It's kind of all over the map, but I think that's what makes it work so well for me. It's a variety album. I've listened to this album way more times than I can count. I love pretty much everything on here. This is one that, again, is very short. So if you haven't listened to it, it only demands 36 minutes of your time. I think you could afford that. If you don't have time for that brisk 36 minutes that this is, I would recommend starting with the opener. Horchata is a fantastic taste of things. I think the closer as well, I Think You're a Contra, that's a beautiful song. Other great highlights would be Run or Diplomat's Son. I'm basically just listing the whole track list. It's not a long album, just give it a shot. I'll never be able to get enough of this project. This was actually one of the albums I put into a Minecraft world with my mod pack. I got into Minecraft modding during the pandemic, and there are records that you can find in the game. So what I did was I replaced the audio files for each record with entire albums, and this is a Minecraft album for me. That's a designation that I don't make lightly.
If I wait.
Looking back, I think Anti-Socialites by Always was another one of my Minecraft albums. I'm going to have a few more on this list, but, for now, I want to call it there. I don't want to take up too much of your time at any given time. I mean, that's why I do the 10-second videos in the first place. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I'm going to come back with a part 2. I guess if you want, you could just stare at the graphic I made and spoil it for you, but I'd love to provide the insight, so stick around.